So we are all working with the AU Dream Initiative, which is an initiative of the Law School's Immigrant Justice Clinic. And we are focused on supporting undocumented and other non-citizen college and university students in our local area. So we provide free immigration legal services, consultations, representation to students who are enrolled at a university in DC, Maryland, or Virginia. So within this context, or like in this work, we've spoken with current and former college students with DACA who wanted to travel abroad, but either they did not know how, or especially in the past few years, did not have the opportunity to get advance parole. So advance parole is an incredible opportunity to travel abroad, but it also carries many risks. And our goal tonight is to provide you all with accurate information so that you can make the decision that's best for you. Before we begin, I'd like to get a sense of who's in the Zoom room tonight. So we're going to take an anonymous poll, and I'm going to launch that right now. So if you can take a minute to just fill out the yes or no answers, and I think there's a multiple choice there.
Do you have DACA? Yes. Do you have TPS? No. Is your primary?
We see some answers coming in. Have like 3/4 of the people participating. Give it a few more seconds.
I see a question in the chat of what is TPS? It's temporary protected status.
All right. So let's end the poll, and hopefully you all can see the results. So we have almost 40 folks with DACA here tonight, one with TPS, and it looks like everyone is interested in learning about DACA generally, which is great because that's exactly what we're going to be doing. So let's see. Have I shared my screen yet? I have not. Let me share the PowerPoint and then we can start that. Okay. All right. So let's begin.
Yeah, so it looks like we have a very diverse audience, some, mostly with DACA, but some TPS there as well. But we know everyone is taking their evening to join us, so we've packed a lot of useful information for this session. Today, we'll be providing an overview of advance parole. We'll be discussing the risk to immigration status, briefly review the advance parole application generally, and then provide you tips for travel along with all the practical tips we'll provide you along the way. We have a lot of material to get through tonight, but we're going to do our best to reserve the last 15 minutes for a Q&A session at the end of our presentation. So we respectfully ask that all of you hold your questions until that time, and then hopefully we'll be able to answer them at the end of the presentation. So moving into overview of advance parole, what is it, who is it, what is it, who is it for, and really why is it important? It's important to understand that advance parole does not grant legal status. It's not an avenue for permanent residence, nor does it grant citizenship. Rather, advance parole is a process where an individual who is currently residing in the US will receive authorization to re-enter the US after temporarily traveling abroad. It's an option really for non-citizens in the US that are in a state of transition, whether that be recipients of DACA, applicants and recipients of TPS, maybe applicants who have filed an adjustment of status application but have not yet received their green card, and then other limited categories. Today, we'll be primarily focusing on the requirements of DACA and highlight the differences and similarities in regards to TPS and those applicants that have applied for adjustment of status. I want to remind everyone that this is an informational session. Gabby was right in that it depends. It's the favorite answer in law school is always it depends. So I want to remind everyone that we are not providing legal advice. Everyone's case could be different, and you should really seek a legal consultation for your very case specific questions. Generally though, advance parole is a part of the government's broader authority to quote unquote parole or allow someone into the US as a matter of discretion. For example, I'm sure you may have seen on the news recently that the government is paroling Afghans into the US, or, alternatively, the criticism surrounding parole for Haitians and not allowing them to enter into the US. It's all part of the same kind of legal scheme where the government holds that power of discretion to allow individuals based on specific reasons. Saba will be expanding on these specific reasons in a few, but as most things that are discretionary, advance parole will vary on a case-by-case basis. It is granted by the United States Citizenship and Immigration Services, or USCIS. The government loves acronyms, and an office within the Department of Homeland Security, or DHS. Yet even with advanced parole being provided by USCIS, it's not always a guarantee that a person will be allowed back into the country if the person leaves. I don't want anybody to get scared. Andrew will go over some of the risk factors and things like that a little bit later. The decision to allow a person back into the country is made by another office within DHS, actually. So what will happen is a Customs and Border Protection officer will make that decision when the person is asking for admission at a port of entry. Usually that's at a specific airport or at the Canadian or Mexico border. These officers are not like the guardians of the gates in the Wizard of Oz. They cannot just exercise unfettered discretion. They can't simply decide who to let in and who not to. But what they'll do is they'll review your documentation they'll review the documentation of the individual to allow them entrance or not. The individual will show a Form I-512L, which you can see on the screen here. They issue it to authorize parole for a set amount of time. Again, this can vary depending on individual circumstances. If for some reason USCIS denies the application, there is really no appeals process. So a person will have to submit another application. Often after mailing the application to USCIS, an applicant will have to wait several months for a response. And at this moment, we're seeing that it's taking up to 6 months to process applications. And so you should really consider that when you're deciding to file your application. You should really consider when you're planning on traveling, what your status is at the moment and things like that. Traveling without advance parole essentially will constitute a break in the continuous residence requirement for DACA and TPS. And this is a really important requirement. This is the requirement that obligates that those individuals with DACA or TPS maintain physical presence in the United States. That's why those dates are always so important. So a person who travels outside of the country without advance parole or some sort of permission could lose their status if they aren't provided permission. Advance parole essentially preserves that continuous residence requirement. Taking into account the time that it will take to process an application, the anticipated date of travel, and then also the individual should understand and wait until their DACA or TPS application is approved, whether that's initial application or renewal, before applying for advance parole, and be sure that their DACA is not nearing any sort of expiration when they are traveling. And again, taking into account those processing times as well. I'm going to turn it over to Saba to expand on what purposes for traveling are acceptable under the different statuses.
Thanks, Rose. So we're going to begin with DACA recipients, and then I'll talk a little bit about TPS and other statuses as well. So the official instructions for the Advance Parole application list the 3 reasons why DACA recipients can apply for Advance Parole and can travel abroad, right? So it's for educational, employment, or humanitarian purposes. Now, the instructions also specifically say that what doesn't count as a vacation. So any application for Advance Parole is going to have to be couched in these terms and for one of these 3 reasons. Let's dig into them. Educational purposes. For those of you who entered the Zoom room early, you might have seen in the chat that TheDream.Us provides scholarship for traveling abroad for educational purposes. So what does that mean? Generally, it's study abroad programs, either through a university or through an outside study abroad company. Like the California Mexico Studies Center, they're accepting applications for an education abroad program in the summer, right? So that's an example of an outside company, a nonprofit that arranges exchange programs. Educational purposes can also be broader, right? It can be academic research, if you're doing research in a lab, if you're doing research for a thesis. It can be academic presentations and conferences. And really, as we go through these 3 reasons for traveling, there is not a ton of official guidance on what constitutes an educational purpose for travel. So it's really up to the individual to make the case and then to support that case through whatever documents they include in their application. So moving on to employment purposes, this could be an overseas temporary assignment. It could be conferences, international conferences abroad, specific trainings, meeting with clients, going for interviews or interviewing other people. All of that counts for employment purposes. Humanitarian purposes is probably the one that folks are most familiar with. And so that generally includes like medical needs. So it can be needing medical treatment for yourself, right? If there's expensive, urgent, dental procedure that's not covered by dental insurance or medical insurance here, that could be a reason, a humanitarian reason to travel abroad. It's if a close family member is getting serious medical treatment. It could be a family member's funeral, or it could be to visit a sick and ailing family member. So again, making the case for each of these, I encourage folks to think expansively, right? So like, are you researching something specific for a thesis? If your college or university doesn't have a cultural exchange program, can you find one on the side? Is there some sort of private company that might have one? Is there a conference in your field that you could try to present at? Do you have an aging relative, like a grandparent or an aunt who took care of you that you need to see? So whatever the reason is, evidence needs to be included in the application, and Rose is going to talk a little bit about that evidence in a bit. And so you'll see that there's a little asterisk here. In emergency cases, like an upcoming funeral that's happening in the next week or 2, or a serious terminal illness for a relative, a person may file their application in person at their local USCIS office. So generally, as Rose mentioned, you submit the paper application and it takes, somewhere like 5 to 8 months to process. It all varies. But if it's an emergency situation, a person can go into USCIS, make that InfoPass appointment, and get a decision at their appointment. So in addition to evaluating whether the purpose of the travel is for one of these 3 purposes shown on the screen, the USCIS officer will evaluate whether the reason is actually an emergency. And again, there's not a ton of guidance on this. So I've had clients who, one of them was denied emergency advance parole to visit a sick relative. I think it was one of their parents with cancer, because the USCIS officer determined that, the health condition of cancer was ongoing and therefore it wasn't an emergency. And then I had another client who was granted emergency advance parole to visit a sick grandparent whose neurological condition made them prone to falling. So I don't see much of a difference between those, but I think what it shows us is that it's really up to the discretion of the USCIS officer, and it's up to us to make the case. And the case that you would want to make in an emergency advance parole application is that the situation is time sensitive. So moving on from DACA. So advance parole is used for like a number of folks in liminal statuses, right? And so some of those other statuses are TPS, temporary protected status, and adjustment of status applicants. That's the AOS. So it's applicants who have filed that I-485 for their green card application. And so, the world is your oyster. You're not limited to the 3 specific reasons that DACA recipients are limited to, right? So if somebody has filed a green card application, they can travel abroad for a vacation. The caveat here is that, there still must be a reason, and it must be a limited amount of time that someone is traveling abroad. So if they're gone for too long, is that considered abandonment of an application? Another thing to consider is like, if you're traveling abroad, can't miss important dates, renewing TPS status, an adjustment of status interview, the green card interview. So it is like a lot less restricted than folks with DACA, but you should still consult with an attorney on like whether you are properly putting together the application and whether the travel that you envision is properly considered temporary travel abroad. So let's move on to the scariest part of this, which are the risks of traveling.
Thank you, Saba. So I'd like to group the risks of traveling into 2 kind of big buckets here. The first one is the risk of denial of reentry at the border. This is what would happen if Customs and Border Protection or your Border Patrol agent, if they might deem someone legally inadmissible, which I'll define a little bit more coming along. And second is loss of future immigration status, or impact actually generally, but in some cases lost. And this could be for a DACA renewal. This could be the case if you're subject to a permanent bar, which I'll also get into a little bit more later. And it could also be an impact if future relief is conditioned on physical presence in the United States on a specific date. And then, of course, I'll touch on briefly just the important consideration of traveling during pandemic times, which, as we all know, impacts that a lot. So the first thing I want to touch on is the denial of reentry section. So the advance parole document authorizes parole, but the decision to actually parole or allow someone to physically enter the United States is up to a border patrol officer at a port of entry, which, as Rose touched on earlier, is oftentimes like an airport. And certain circumstances may heighten the risk of being denied entry. So I listed a few of the risk factors here. One is a person is traveling outside the dates authorized by the advance parole document. Another is a person traveling when their DACA authorization has expired. Third is if a person has a prior exclusion, deportation, or removal order. Fourth is a person's present without documents in the United States. They leave and then they re-enter unlawfully. That one's a little bit more complicated, and we'll talk about that. And then the last one is if a person has had contact with police or prosecutors in the United States in a manner that makes them inadmissible under immigration law. So the first 2 risks here are grouped together. They're related to the dates on documents. So the main tip here is just checking and double checking dates. That'll help mitigate this risk. So for instance, this advance parole document that you see here was issued this summer, and it has the phrase prior to July 21st, 2021. This means that the traveler must be at the airport going through customs by July 20th, 2021 in order to fulfill that. So in general, just making sure that flights are not booked near the end of valid time periods for both advanced parole and DACA to kind of shore that up. And again, and I'll discuss it a little bit more with a slide on COVID considerations itself, but definitely just kind of noting COVID protocols to give more cushion time with especially the end period date. So next, let's discuss prior removal orders. So I'm going to explore a few ways in which a person could have gotten a deportation order. So for instance, here I have an example. So when Sarah was a baby, she entered the United States with her mother in 1998. Sarah's mother applied for asylum with Sarah as a derivative on the application, but an immigration judge denied asylum and entered a deportation order that year. Sarah and her mother, however, remained in the United States undocumented, and Sarah received DACA in 2013. So this would be an example of an unexecuted removal order. Another kind of similar example would be, well, what if Sarah's mother was instead detained at the border and then released with a stack of documents, only to find out many years later that one of those documents had a court date on it for herself and for Sarah, but they'd missed it years ago. And that in absentia, without them being there, the immigration judge entered a removal order. This would also be an example of an unexecuted removal order. And finally, another instance could be if at the border, immigration detained Sarah and her mother, fingerprinted them, processed them, and then turned them around. But that a few days later, Sarah and her mother crossed the border, but this time had no interactions with immigration. This would be an example of an executed removal order because in this case, Sarah was physically deported from the country and then re-entered. So in each of these scenarios, Sarah had a prior removal order, but was still able to get DACA and would also potentially still be able to get advanced parole if she applied for it, meeting the criteria that we discussed earlier. But in cases where a person physically left the country after a removal order and then re-entered again, they would trigger something called the permanent bar. So if they travel on advanced parole now, they will be subject to this bar when they try to re-enter the United States. So in this section, kind of the main tip is to try to do what you can to confirm any prior removal orders. So a person can talk to their parents or other older family members, especially because some of these interactions might have happened, as in the first example, when someone's a child. And another alternative is filing a Freedom of Information Act request, also known as a FOIA request. And that can be done with the various immigration agencies. So we've mentioned Customs and Border Protection, USCIS, entities like that. So here I have another hypothetical. So in this one, Moira enters the United States without inspection in 2001 when she's a child. In 2006, Moira and her family visited Argentina for the summer, and they re-entered the United States without inspection. In 2013, Moira was a senior in college, and her school helped her apply for and receive DACA, and she's successfully renewed DACA since then. Now, Moira is a doctoral student, and she wishes to participate in a popular international conference that's held every summer in Geneva. Her abstract has been accepted. She's been even given time to speak at the conference. Moira reads about advanced parole and thinks that the conference would definitely qualify for educational travel for DACA recipients, like we discussed earlier, and would be beneficial both to her education and her career. Should she apply for advanced parole? So we're going to launch a poll question if you would like to take a moment to answer that. Right, just a few more moments. Okay. So a lot of people said yes, and some people said no. Would anybody like to volunteer and share their answer and why they might have said that? That's all right if nobody wants to jump in. Oh, saw a raised hand. Yes, Valentina.
So I voted for yes only because it seems like her DACA is not expired and she, like there hasn't been like prior exclusion or removal or deportation order. I was just confused by the fact that she left and then she re-entered, but if there was no inspection or that, then yeah, I'm not sure.
Yes, well, thank you for your answer. So with the things that you mentioned, for purposes of the dates, all of that checked out. But unfortunately, the answer here would actually be that Moira would be considered a non-citizen seeking admission when she flies back into an airport in the United States. And because in 2006, when she left the United States to go to Argentina for the summer and then came back, her movement triggered the permanent bar in immigration law. And this wouldn't have been a problem for and it wasn't a problem for DACA, and it wasn't a problem while Moira was actually in the United States. But however, and you touched on this, your reason for being a little bit confused, because she left the United States and is now asking for admission to come in, the CBP can and likely would deny her entry at the border. And this is because she entered without inspection unlawfully that second time re-entry. So here, this is all kind of grouped under this risk factor, which is prior periods of unlawful presence. So that can be a person re-entering or attempting to re-enter unlawfully after accruing more than a year of unlawful presence in the aggregate triggers a permanent bar to admissibility. So breaking this down a little bit, in the aggregate means in total. Therefore, this can include multiple smaller periods of time so long as they all together exceed a year of unlawful presence. This applies to minors, and it can still create problems even though, as we mentioned, it doesn't make a person ineligible for DACA or for the actual advance parole document itself. It's the problem is with that it could make someone inadmissible. So the kind of tip here is being really thorough, checking all prior entries and departures, just being as thorough as possible in that capacity. And that could involve kind of like how we mentioned before, in some cases talking to family members, especially ones that are older, to just kind of make sure that knowing all your entries and departures. So here we've got another hypothetical. So this one involves Thomas. So when Thomas was a sophomore in college, he was convicted of a misdemeanor possession of a controlled substance, marijuana. And he was given 2 years probation, but no jail time. With this conviction, Thomas filed an initial application for DACA in January 2021, and he received a discretionary grant of DACA in June of that year. Now, Thomas's maternal grandmother is terminally ill. She's unresponsive to cancer treatment. Thomas reads online about advance parole and decides to apply for emergency advance parole to travel abroad for humanitarian reasons, one of those other areas that we discussed earlier. Thomas fills out the application, he makes an appointment with USCIS, and he's given an approved I-512L advance parole document. Should Thomas travel abroad? So we've got another poll question here on this one. All right, just a few more moments. Okay. So I'm seeing a few more no responses this time. Does anybody want to share maybe why they put no in this instance? Yes, I see Kevin's response in the chat, and that is exactly right. It's a little bit more nuanced, but we'll get into that. But broadly speaking, um, any conviction that's relating to a controlled substance on the federal schedules subjects someone who's a non-citizen to grounds of admissibility. So even with Thomas's valid DACA and advance parole documentation, he would very likely be stopped by CBP at the airport and found inadmissible because of that controlled substance conviction. And so, as was stated, so this is kind of grouped under that big factor of contact with the criminal legal system. So, as you might have heard, there's been a steady kind of intertwining of the criminal and the immigration legal systems in the United States. You might have also heard of the term aggravated felony and know that criminal convictions of certain types can lead to deportation. In cases involving travel abroad for folks with DACA, there's three kind of broad things to be aware of. First, it's that a criminal conviction might not bar someone from getting DACA or TPS, just like in the case of the permanent bar in the last few slides. But it might make someone legally inadmissible, meaning that Border Patrol could prevent a person from entering the country. And convictions of certain crimes act as criminal bars to admissibility. And there's two kind of broad categories of crimes here. One is called crimes involving moral turpitude. Um, so this could be examples are certain aggravated felonies or fraud. And then another broad category is the one that we just saw in the hypothetical, which are controlled substance offenses. And these also include attempts to commit offenses as well. And a second large grouping is that a second point here is that someone might not have a conviction, but they were arrested and charged, and then those charges were dropped. Border Patrol might question someone about this at the border, and if they formally admit to facts that constitute a crime, this might make them inadmissible. So I have kind of a smaller hypothetical here. So let's say that Jack is at the airport. He's being questioned by a Border Patrol officer who notices that he was arrested and charged with theft a few months ago. Jack says that he was never convicted. They dropped the charge. But the Border Patrol officer starts asking Jack some questions. So Jack responds, I went to court and that the prosecutor offered a plea that if Jack admitted to what he did and completed 40 hours of community service, then the prosecutor would drop the charge. So Jack did just that. In this instance, Border Patrol might interpret this as a conviction. So this is just something to be considerate of. And the third kind of main point here is that although most traffic and civil violations are not crimes and shouldn't bar someone from DACA or TPS or even admission, there might be some violations that carry additional consequences. One example might be using a fake ID. So just the kind of general tip here is knowing if there's anything in your record that might make someone inadmissible. If you've had any encounters with law enforcement, you can do an online search. In many states, you can do this through the court system. So, for instance, I'm here in DC. I know that Maryland nearby has a system like this, and a lot of other states too as well. Another alternative is to get police or arrest reports or get records from a courthouse clerk. And if you've lived in many states and different places, you can also do an FBI background check using fingerprints. And so traveling abroad, even with advanced parole documentation, might also carry consequences for a DACA recipient's future immigration status or TPS as well. First, a person might have trouble renewing their DACA. So a few years ago, there were reports that USCIS was denying DACA renewals if a person traveled outside the authorized period on their advance parole document, or if they re-enter the United States after the DACA expired. So this is kind of along the lines of making sure that the dates are kind of correct in terms of traveling. A person who's traveled might also receive a request for evidence when they renewed their DACA. So just in general, it's a good idea to save a copy of the advance parole document, airline tickets, maybe even hotel stays or whatever residence, just things that can show those dates. And then second, as I mentioned above, a person might be subject to the permanent bar, which means that even if they had a way to get a visa or a green card in the United States, for instance, through a family member, they would be barred from doing so. And it's called the permanent bar, although it's in effect permanent, although a person might be able to ask for permission to re-enter the United States after 10 years. But still, it's a pretty large consideration there. And third, even if travel does not trigger the permanent bar, it might have triggered another ground of inadmissibility. For instance, if travel executed a deportation order, a person might have to seek a waiver when applying for status in the future. And then another consideration is there might be a risk to future immigration status. So if legislators make a path to residency contingent on someone's physical presence in the United States on a specific date, then there's a risk that someone might be, traveling abroad during that date. That's that third one there in the PowerPoint. And then the last point that I want to make is it's actually not a risk at all, but it could even be considered a future advantage. So if someone entered the country without inspection, meaning without permission or documentation, they still could have received DACA. If this person then became eligible for a green card, let's say through a spouse or a child who's a United States citizen, they would then have to complete the green card process at a United States consulate in their home country before flying back to the United States. This is termed consular processing. Up until now, DACA recipients who initially entered without inspection and then traveled abroad on advance parole have been able to avoid consular processing and complete the green card adjustment of status process here in the United States. Recently, cases before immigration agencies and even the Supreme Court found, however, that people with temporary protected status, TPS, who traveled on advance parole must still complete consular processing to get their green card. As far as we know, this requirement for consular processing is limited to folks with TPS as of now and is not being applied to people with DACA. But it's something that is kind of a live question now as a result of that, and just something to consider. And last but not least, for my section, COVID considerations for travelers. So we've provided here links to a couple of sites here for anyone to check out, kind of going through them. So the CDC has a list of banned countries. Changes are made to that list periodically depending on the COVID levels in the country. So the Biden administration has actually hinted that they will remove this list and instead just make it a requirement that everyone is vaccinated. But for now, the list exists and is still relevant. And this is important just because there's new COVID variants. Some of you might have heard about the Delta variant that was emerging over the summer. There's a possibility for future variants. We're just unsure how they and their impacts are going to play out in the future. And then last, so PCR tests are required within 3 days of re-entering the United States. And this could be problematic if a person contracts COVID while abroad and is then prohibited from re-entering. So again, just stressing considerations of the dates with traveling. So now I'm gonna hand it over back to Rose to talk a little bit about putting together the advance parole application.
Thank you so much, Andrew. Those examples are really helpful. I'm glad that everyone's engaged. I get the fun part about putting together the application. I am going to kind of go through this pretty quickly. I just want to be mindful. I want to give us enough time for questions and answers. So the application itself is pretty simple, pretty straightforward. You're going to answer questions on the form, but in general, immigration forms and documents can be tedious in regards to the evidence required. And the fee for this application is $575, and there is no fee waiver. So you will have to pay that every time that you apply. And if for some reason you receive a denial of your application, there is no appeals process. So you want to be sure that the evidence and the answers that you have on those forms are airtight. And what you're going to want to provide is a copy of an official photo ID. You'll see the form here, Form I-131, and 2 identical passport style photos taken within 30 days of filing the application. So don't use any old photos that you used for previous passports years ago. A copy of any document showing your current status in the United States. That's for DACA or TPS. That could be the Form I-797, or applicants who have submitted an adjustment of status application. Those applicants can actually submit a receipt notice confirming that they have submitted the I-485 application. Applicants will also need to include evidence that the trip is one falling within those purposes that Saba highlighted earlier. So whether it's educational, employment, or humanitarian, or if the applicant has TPS, it could be broader. Those examples of that could be any health records, work program, descriptions, or any type of documentation from the university. Applicants should also understand that their own statement explain why travel is required or beneficial can also be considered evidence. The applicant wants to be able to provide an explanation of why the travel is necessary and why the travel is educational or humanitarian, or for employment purposes. An applicant traveling for, say, a family who is ill or anything of that sort would be able to provide declarations from family members or from treating physicians. Again, I want to reiterate that individuals who have filed an adjustment of status application, they just haven't received their visa yet or an approval, but they have that receipt notice. So it's not an approval, it's a receipt notice that can be used as evidence that the adjustment application was filed, and they are only waiting for that. I do want to run through a couple of things in regards to a checklist for legal consultation. Applicants should be sure to always assess the risk of traveling by looking at their history to determine how risky it is for them to travel, as we went over those examples. But of course, each case is different. You know, we don't have, you know, every case figured out. So applicants may look to consult an attorney for their own individual application. And what you're going to want is you're going to want to bring with you, those applicants are going to want to bring with them their most recent DACA application, any approval notices, whether it be DACA or TPS or adjustment of status, any type of work permit that the applicant has, a valid passport, and then also any prior immigration records, or if there has been some sort of interaction with the criminal justice system, any records relating to that for tickets, arrests, charges, and conviction. And also the applicant is going to want to highlight information on the educational program abroad that they're applying for and that they're looking to attend. We want to go through some practical tips real quick. Saba's going to touch on some practical tips, and then we'll get into the Q&A.
Okay, I am going to speed through these, and these are really practical tips if someone has received advance parole and they're traveling, and just what that process looks like when they are entering at an airport and going through customs. So there's really 2 or 3 steps in this customs inspection process. So the first is like going to a customs kiosk where you scan your passport. It sort of spits out a receipt, and then moving on to the second step, which is inspection by a CBP officer who's usually sitting behind the booth. And at this point, the traveler should produce the original approved advance parole document, which we showed earlier, along with their passport. And this might be sufficient. The CBP officer might ask some questions about the purpose and the nature of the travel, they might either stamp the passport or they might stamp that advance parole document. So especially for DACA recipients, but really for TPS recipients, it's important to have that stamp, especially when you're renewing and, for the next DACA or TPS authorization, or if someone is applying for a green card and they have DACA, it could enable them to go through the adjustment of status process here in the US instead of consular processing. So, at this point, they might get that stamp and, they're on their way. Or, and this is what likely happens, is that the CBP officer takes the passport and asks the person to step aside for a secondary screening. So that's the third photo that we see on the screen. Secondary screening usually happens in this waiting room place where travelers, US citizens, non-US citizens alike, they are waiting for questioning by a CBP officer. Here, a traveler should have other documents with them, right? So in addition to that advance parole document, maybe the original advance parole or a copy of the advance parole application, proof of their status. So that could be the work permit with the validity dates. It can be the approval notice for DACA or TPS. And then if the person has spoken and retained an attorney, they can have the attorney's G28, which is basically a notice to CBP that, hey, I'm represented by an attorney and, I want you to speak with my attorney. While in secondary inspection, travelers should also be prepared for searches and questioning. So that's anything that a person has on them, including their luggage, including electronic devices, so cell phones, laptops. There is, there's, I think, yes, I would advise for people to be prepared to have their electronic devices searched. And then they might also be subject to questioning, like very targeted questioning about their immigration history or some sort of contact with the criminal system or where they went, when they were traveling, what they did. And then on a last note, like when someone is re-entering the United States, they're going to go through customs the first place at which they went. So if someone is trying to get here to DC, but they have, they're going through Miami, and that's the first spot that they land in the US, that's where they're going to go through customs and inspection. So, does the person have like community there? Do they have an attorney there? Are people on notice? Or would they want to fly into DC directly into customs there? And so, we've thrown a lot of information at you in like 45 minutes. And I just want to sort of wrap it all up together. Is advance parole right for you? There's always a risk in traveling abroad, right? There's always a risk in leaving the United States. And for some people, that risk is more, and for some people, that risk is less. So it's important to consult an attorney and understand the risks. And also like research options, because it is risky and it is also an opportunity, right? So research those options if someone can travel abroad for those educational, employment, or humanitarian purposes. And then lastly, gather the documents. So people want to put together the strongest application possible in the beginning because there is no appeals process and because it's really expensive. So gathering the documents, making a strong application after doing your research, after understanding your risks, advance parole can be a really great opportunity. And lastly, we keep saying, consult an attorney, and we know that attorneys are expensive. Not us, because we do everything for free, but there are options, right? So AU Dream, if folks are in the DMV area, they can contact us for an individual confidential consultation. There's a couple of databases, Informed Immigrant, the Immigration Advocates Network, and they have a directory of low-cost, low bono legal service providers. Then also if someone is enrolled in a college or university, they might have an undocumented students program or a documented student center. But even if they don't, sometimes universities will contract with local legal service providers or have an MOU with them where they can have a free consultation with an attorney. So just look into that. And that concludes the, lecture portion of our presentation tonight. And now I'm going to stop sharing our slides, and we want to open this up to questions. And so as we do this, I just want to remind folks that we cannot provide personalized legal advice at this moment, because we just don't know what's going on with the case, right? Like, I would always have to see documents. So please try to keep your questions general, ask for a friend if you need to, ask generally, and we'll try to do the best that we can.
Yes, Kevin, I see you raised your hand.
Yeah, so I guess like one of the scarier parts is definitely like the impact on the future immigration status. Uh, and I guess like I wanted to know a little bit more on like the permanent bar.
Sorry, we missed that.
Yeah, sorry. So what I was saying is like what are the reasons on like why there would be a permanent bar? Also like you also mentioned like the reasons on future residency on a physical presence. So like in case something were to be passed, like can we receive more information on that as to why that happens, or what makes it even more riskier?
Yeah, that's a great question on what, is the permanent bar. And I think we do have a guide on the AU Dream website, which should be helpful. We have citations in there. But I think the short answer is if there are either multiple periods of unlawful presence, right? So there's going into the country and out of the country and back into the country again, that has triggered the permanent bar. If there is a deportation order that was executed, right? So someone had a deportation order in their past, either through the immigration court, or it might have been an expedited deportation order that just happened at the border really quickly. So it was executed, meaning that person was deported and just came back in. So that could have triggered the permanent bar as well. Now, if someone has a deportation order right now, but it has not been executed, that won't necessarily trigger the permanent bar. And so again, this is complicated, and it would require an attorney to take a really close look at someone's immigration record. So, I encourage folks to, like, if there are no papers, but like, heard that someone was in immigration court, file a FOIA request, understand like the immigration documents and what the immigration history was, and share that with an attorney, and they can provide you better individualized advice.
Okay, and like what about the whole like barring in case like there were like the Senate were to pass or Congress were to pass like an immigration reform? What about that? Like for example, I know it was advised not to adding the immigration reform into the reconciliation process. But if it would have gone through, or it still is going through, like would that be something that would also be barred in case like one were to like study abroad on advanced parole? Like, or is it just depends on each case, like each law that they make, if they make any laws?
Okay, I think what you're asking is like, if this was conditioned on someone being present in the US on January 1st, 2021, and that person was traveling abroad on advance parole. And so I think that is a consideration. Like we've seen that happen with DACA, right? Like someone had to be present in the US on a very specific day in 2012 in order to get DACA. And so, there is a possibility that any future status would be conditioned on that. The likelihood of that, or the likelihood of something passing while someone is, doing study abroad this semester, I don't know, but it's a risk. I think there's also a legal argument that somebody could make if they were traveling abroad temporarily on advance parole that shouldn't count against their presence in the US. But that's just an open question that remains to be seen. I think for folks who are considering traveling abroad on advance parole, don't let the possibility of like immigration reform passing one day and being conditioned on a specific date, don't let that be the factor that stops you. Okay,
Yeah, I want
let's,
to touch on one of the, before we move to, I see Paulo has his hands up. There was a question in the chat of, are we required to be back, or sorry, in any of my supporting documents are written in another language, like a doctor's note, does it need to be translated into English? It does. So you're going to want to provide, or the applicant's going to want to provide the original documentation in whatever language it is, whether it's Spanish, Arabic, whatever language it is. You're going to want to provide a translated document, and then whoever translated that document will need to attest to the fact that they are fluent and it's an accurate translation. They are not required to be certified, but they will have to attest to the fact that they are fluent in the language and attest to the fact that they've translated it in an accurate and thorough manner. So Pablo, I'm going to ask you to unmute yourself. I'm not sure if if the same question is the one that was in the chat, but I'll let you unmute yourself.
Thank you. So yeah, same question. Are we required to be vaccinated? Have any of you dealt with any recent advanced parole cases? And did they ask for vaccination status?
yeah, that's a great question. So we did bring up the COVID considerations because I think it makes international travel more difficult. At the moment, I don't think that there's a vaccination requirement. However, what I heard this week is that the Biden administration is considering taking away that list of banned countries they have and replacing it with a vaccination requirement. So that's a consideration for anyone to sort of keep up with those like CDC travel restrictions that are being put out as well.
And as of now, so as of now, if you have like an exemption or something, would you imagine it would be valid, or do you feel that it's a risk to not, be vaccinated and, try to return through advanced parole? And I know you just mentioned the whole, and then I know there's also, there was something that was passed by USCIS, I believe, on October 1st, something to do with like vaccination status as well. I think anyone who receives something from, and don't quote me on this, but I believe I read on the website that it said that by starting October 1st, they're requiring like vaccination if you receive anything from USCIS. Did you see any of that?
Yeah, I think that's for adjustment of status applicants, right? So for like green card applicants, they're requiring vaccination. And I think another consideration that's like whether or not the CDC requires vaccines for international travel is the risk that unvaccinated people are much more likely to contract COVID and then would have to stay abroad until they were cleared to travel, and that might push them out of their advanced parole dates. So I think this is really a personal question for folks and like what they feel safe with. And, I would say that it probably does increase risks if someone is traveling abroad without a vaccine, especially in an area where there is a high level of COVID.
Yeah, I also think that there are also a lot of other countries that are requiring you to be vaccinated to go. I know that just from travel, I'm getting ready to travel to Europe, and they're requiring vaccination. So I want to touch on Kevin's question in the chat that says, should one consider applying to enter a study abroad program first before starting the process to apply for advanced parole? If the individual is looking to, they know that they're going to enter a study abroad program, or they know that they have some employment prospects internationally, and they're wanting to take advantage of that, they do want to start the process for advanced parole as soon as possible, not necessarily when they're accepted or when they have confirmation, because of the processing time. It could take some time to process. So some of the things that you can, some of the evidence that the person could include in their application would be the information on whether there's like sometimes there's like pamphlets, or sometimes the university will provide different informational guides as far as what the study abroad program looks like, before even letting people know if they're accepted or not. So definitely starting the process as soon as you believe that you're going to be traveling abroad for for any of those three purposes. And then Anna, I'm going to ask you if you want to unmute yourself. I see your hands up.
Yes, hello. So thank you so much. First of all, it was super informative. I actually work at the study abroad department at Grand Canyon University. And so it's super neat to know that students, DACA recipients can apply for a study abroad program. But my question is there a limit, like a time frame limit for how long they can apply for advanced parole, because we have semester-long programs, we have year-long programs. So is there a certain limit? And then my second question, and I think it's to Kevin's point as well, sometimes they do need to apply for a visa for that country. So which comes first, advanced parole or visa, or is visa going to be part of their evidence for the advanced parole application? So if you can provide some guidance on that, that would be great. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, these are all really great questions. Actually, on the AU Dream website, we did a similar seminar that was geared towards, like university administrators and study abroad offices as well. So I think the timeline is tricky here because we say like give at least 6 months, and I would say closer to a year just to get that advanced parole application like processed. And so I think the trick here is working with folks like you in universities who are also willing to be more flexible with the university rules and allowing students with DACA to apply ahead of time, right? And to like give them that space and give them the documentation. So they need proof from their university that they've been accepted into a study abroad program. And so, your office could provide that. And then for the visa, it depends on how long it takes to get a visa to another country. I think, it would make sense to do it after receiving advanced parole if there's still a few months before they travel. I think if you can get a visa like a year in advance to a country, you could do it before. But really it's trying to like map everything out and around USCIS's processing times, which are really difficult. So I think definitely flexibility from the university, making sure that advanced parole document is in hand, and then applying for the visa. In terms of like the semester and year-long programs, there is this idea that it's supposed to be temporary travel abroad. You don't want it to be too long, otherwise it's like considering abandoning status or breaking residence. There's a possibility of applying for multiple entries, right? So like one semester and then coming back and then doing another semester. And, I wouldn't definitively say yes or no to a year abroad, but I think it would need like a lot of documentation from both the student and the university about why this year abroad is so crucial to the education and to the degree and like how it's going to help them. And it's like only 1 year out of 4 years of education, and they've been in the country for X years, and this is what they intend to do with their education when they're back. So I think there's ways to argue for a year abroad program.
Awesome, thank you. And do you guys have any additional resources for study abroad providers, international students office? Because we do have, every year we do have a few students who are super interested in, and in the past they couldn't. And so I'm super excited that they can now, even though there are known risks but if there is, I think I just want to be well versed in this so that I can guide the students who really want to do a study abroad program or travel internationally. So if you can include, any links in the chat or just guide me to whatever resources you have, that would be awesome.
Sure, I can include links in the chat. I don't think there's like super in-depth resources because the best advice would be to have an attorney do like an individualized assessment of someone's case.
Gotcha.
So perhaps, encouraging the university to contact or to contract with like local attorneys or nonprofits or something.
Gotcha. Thanks so much.
Yeah. we're looking at another question in the, so I answered a few questions in the chat of whether undocumented folks without DACA or TPS can travel domestically. Yes, absolutely. There's no requirement for advance parole to travel domestically. Also, there's lots of folks who can travel with on advance parole, not just DACA and TPS, right? So people are pending green card applications, U visa recipients. There's another question here that someone would like to travel and see their family that they haven't seen in nearly 25 years, but there's no sort of urgent reason, right? So no one is sick, and what are their options? So for humanitarian purposes, there does have to be like a sense of urgency. So if someone can't travel abroad for humanitarian purposes, for like a relative being sick or a relative ill, they can also see if there's something, if they need a medical procedure, if they need a dental procedure, they can try to do that. Or it would have to be for the educational or employment purposes, right? So I think this is really hard for DACA recipients because it's limited to those three purposes. And I also know that there's many organizations here in DC who are lobbying USCIS to lift those restrictions and to make it so that folks with DACA can travel abroad for any purpose. That just has not happened yet. So I'm also going to link our website here in the chat. And if anyone does have questions, feel free to pass them to Gabby, or you can contact us directly.
Saba, would you mind mentioning again just where this video will be, the recording will be located when we're all done? I've seen that pop up a few times.
I think that's up to Gabby.
Yeah, so we have recorded this, and the recording will be sent out by email to all the scholars. And then we'll probably put it on the website and share it to on the Facebook page that we have for the scholars.
Cool.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Yeah, and then I know we're over time, but just one last question, like, is it safe to apply for advance parole now, or should we be waiting? So even after the DACA decision this summer in July, USCIS indicated that they are still accepting advance parole applications, and they have not changed their position on that. And so we've had folks travel this summer, after the decision. So I don't think it's any less safe than it was earlier this year or prior to the Trump administration. So if you feel like applying, consult an attorney and go forth with that application. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Gabby, for having us and allowing to speak with all your wonderful scholars. And folks in the DC area, please feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions. And folks not in the DC area, you can also reach out and we'll try to refer you to some attorneys if you need that.
Yeah, thank you so much, everyone. I wish we had more time.
Thank you for all of your great questions.
Yes, so to Saba, Rose, and Andrew, thank you so much for your time tonight. To all the scholars who joined us, thank you as well. And just want to let you know that when I had DACA, I requested 3 different times advance parole. I was able to travel twice. Once I got denied the ability to travel, and I was able to travel with an educational purpose and then on a humanitarian reason. So it's doable, it's possible, but the key thing here, as Rose, Andrew, and Saba have mentioned, is talking to an attorney and making sure that you check all those boxes. So make sure you do that, and hope everybody has a really good night. Thank you.
Good night.
Good night.